We begin this episode in July of 1984. Last episode we covered the 9 games that Nintendo released in 1983, and then the mere 6 games that Nintendo released in the first half of 1984. They actually slowed down their output a little bit in the beginning of 1984. However, at this point things would really start picking up for the Nintendo. Sales were steadily increasing, and by the end of the year, Nintendo would dominate the home console market in Japan. Something you may have noticed about the games from 83 and 84 so far is that they were all released and developed by Nintendo themselves. They were not, as of yet, working with any third-party developers. The end of 1984 will see a flurry of new releases for the Famicom. From 1984, we have Donkey Kong 3. This was, of course, a port of the 1983 arcade game, and Donkey Kong 3 is sort of the red-headed stepchild of the Donkey Kong games. It wasn't nearly as successful as Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. It's actually quite a bit different than those games. In fact, this seems to be the first example of a rather strange Nintendo tradition of releasing sequels that are radically different than the original game. For example, we'll see that again with games like Zelda and Castlevania. This game really isn't a platformer. In fact, it's almost more of a Galaxian type shooter. These insect things come out and you have to shoot them, but of course you also have to shoot Donkey Kong and get him up at the very top until his head hits the beehive there. Now apparently your character's name is Stanley. Obviously Mario is not in this game. For some reason Donkey Kong has invaded your greenhouse and you're simply trying to chase him away with bug spray of all things. Various bees come out of the beehives. There's a queen bee that blows shrapnel at you. The beginning levels of this are pretty easy. Later levels get a little bit harder. One thing that makes the later levels kind of annoying are the little caterpillars that crawl in front of Donkey Kong, and they get in your way when you're trying to spray him. You do have a powered-up bug spray that is limited use, and you only get so many of those per game. While Donkey Kong 3 certainly isn't a bad game, it just doesn't have the same kind of appeal as Donkey Kong and Donkey Kong Jr. did. It seems that Nintendo went a little bit too far trying to change the formula of this game. Now, of course, you can get killed a number of ways. The bees can hit you. Donkey Kong himself will actually come down and get you if you let him get far enough down. As we see here, the caterpillars are preventing me from spraying Donkey Kong. They stop when you spray them, so if you spray them when he's there in front of Donkey Kong, he'll be very hard to hit. There you go. And the bees will also try to steal your flowers for some reason. You'll get bonus points if you have all your flower pots there at the end of each stage. So I guess the final verdict on Donkey Kong is it is fun to play, but not quite the same classic as the previous 2 games in the franchise were. Nintendo would abandon Donkey Kong for quite some time after this. It would be a number of years before they made a new Donkey Kong game. Here we have Nuts and Milk, and as you may have noticed, this game is not developed by Nintendo. It's developed by Hudson Soft. That's right, this is in fact the first third-party game released for the Famicom. course many more would follow soon. The name Hudson might lead you into thinking that this was not a Japanese company, but in fact they were. They were actually named after a locomotive, or rather a type of locomotive that was originally developed by the New York Central Railroad. This kind of locomotive was actually common in Japan at the time, and one of the executives at Hudson was a train fanatic. This game was originally a port for the MSX computer. Here we see the original MSX version. This came out in 1983. This was developed by Hudson Soft. As you can see, they reworked it substantially for the Nintendo. This original version is sort of like a top-down maze type game, which were quite popular at the time. The Nintendo version is more like a side-view platformer type game, consistent with things like Donkey Kong and Mario Brothers. The basic gameplay is the same. You control the little character, the little pink character whose name is Milk. The antagonist's name is Nuts. That's the little yellow fellow that's chasing you. The object is to collect all the fruit. This will open up the door at the top, and you'll be able to go visit your girlfriend. Once you go up there to her house, then you move on to the next level. Whereas most Nintendo games, like Donkey Kong, had a pretty limited number of levels. Nuts and Milk actually has 50 levels. That sounds impressive, but most of the levels are just based with a finite number of elements that are just sort of rearranged from level to level, sort of this, different combinations of pipes, chains, bricks, and so on and so forth. The Nintendo games such as Donkey Kong, each level is basically completely different and built up from scratch. Your character can jump and climb up little chains, however he can't jump over enemies. He can fall. Doesn't hurt him, but he does have to jump up again to get moving. Most of the enemies in Nuts and Milk tend to move in sort of set patterns, so the game has a certain strategic feel to it. You really can't confront the enemies directly, as I mentioned before, you can't jump over them and they'll simply kill you if you run into them. So it's more a matter of being careful where you go and avoiding the enemies. Let me tell you a bit more about Hudson Soft. They were a Japanese electronics company that was formed in the mid-70s. By the early 80s, they began developing video games, mostly for Japanese computers. They did a number of titles for the Famicom. Many of them were ports of games that originally appeared on Japanese computers. That's why games like this, for example, have level editors. Those are just features that were taken directly from the computer version. Eventually, they would become a competitor of the Famicom. They released their own home console system called the PC Engine a few years later. They're actually still around. They were purchased by Konami a few years ago. Probably their most famous franchise is the Bomberman franchise. Now, prior to this game, Nintendo was developing every single title for the Famicom themselves at the rate of about one a month. The fact that they were now working with third-party developers means that they could take more time developing games and would eventually make much longer, better games. We'll see the fruits of that in the next few months. Next up, we have Lode Runner, once again by Hudson Soft. This is actually a port of an American PC game, originally produced by the Broderbund Company. Now, if you were around and playing PC games or computer games in the early 80s, I suspect you'll probably remember this game. It seemed quite ubiquitous on computers like the Apple, so it's not surprising that someone brought it to Japan. The object of this game is to navigate the little mazes here and collect all the piles of gold dust while avoiding the enemies. You can dig holes that your enemies will fall in. Lode Runner can actually be quite hard. The difficulty is somewhat mitigated by the fact that it's quite easy to get bonus lives. However, it's quite easy to lose them, as there are many situations where you find yourselves being stuck or cornered by enemies and you can't escape in time. Again, there's quite a bit of strategy involved for this game. If you're not careful, you will get cornered by your enemies, and there's pretty much no way to avoid them other than trying to dig a hole. This game has quite a few levels. I think the Famicom version has around 50, I think. Some of the later levels can get quite difficult. Every time you've collected all the bars of all the piles of gold dust, you'll move on to the next level. As you may have noticed, the enemy characters look suspiciously like Bomberman. They actually looked a little different in the original American version of this game. It seems that Hudson Soft redesigned them for this. Later, of course, when they developed Bomberman, they would just use the same sprite. Lode Runner was a huge hit for the Famicom, reportedly selling over 1 million copies. This helped establish Hudson Soft as a major player in the Japanese gaming field. One interesting thing about this game, if the concept of running up and down and climbing ladders seems a little familiar, that's because this game was actually inspired by Donkey Kong. In fact, the first working build of this game was called Kong. Of course, later they changed the title to Lode Runner. But definitely Donkey Kong was a big inspiration to the designers of this game, so it's quite appropriate that it ended up in the Famicom. As I mentioned earlier, Hudson Soft was the first outside developer to be used by Nintendo for the Famicom. They certainly wouldn't be the last. More and more would be added over the next year or so. This had both advantages and disadvantages. On the positive side, a lot more games could actually be released for the Famicom. On the negative side, there were certainly games that were not up to the high standards set by Nintendo. For the time being, however, that's not really an issue. Certainly this port of Lode Runner is very good. At the time the original home computer version came out, Lode Runner was considered to be one of the most challenging and well-designed computer games ever made, and this Famicom port certainly stands up well to the original version. From September 1984 we have Galaxian. As you have seen, this game was developed by Namco, based on their 1979 arcade game. Now Namco is a Tokyo-based entertainment company that's been around since the mid-50s. What the name actually means is Nakamura Manufacturing Company. In the late 70s they started making arcade games, and ended up releasing several enormously popular titles, such as Galaxian, this game, Pac-Man, Dig Dug, Galaga, and quite a few others. So it seems that it must have been quite an achievement for Nintendo to bring aboard a big company like Namco to make games for the Famicom. This is quite possibly a sign of the Famicom's growing popularity in Japan. You may have noticed that the name on this game actually says Namcot. All the Famicom games were released under the name Namcot rather than Namco. No one really knows what that means, but the only theory I've ever heard is that that might possibly stand for Namco Home Entertainment. As for the game itself, well, it was certainly a pioneering game of its time, one of the first all-color games ever released. Over the years, I don't know how kind time has been to this game. The sequel, Galaga, is still a lot more playable, but Galaxian is still a reasonably fun game to play. And from October 1984, we have Devil. Now seriously, when people start talking about these oddball Japanese games, this is exactly the sort of thing that they're referring to. This game is notable for 3 reasons. First of all, it was designed by the great Shigeru Miyamoto, the same guy who designed Donkey Kong, Super Mario Bros., Zelda, all those classics. Second, it was never released in the US. I believe this is actually the only Miyamoto game that was not released in the United States. And lastly, it's just really, really weird. This game makes no sense at all. As you may have noticed, this game sort of resembles Pac-Man in the fact that you're running around in a little maze, and what this is about is that you are a dragon named Tamagon who for some reason decides to attack the Devil World. Now, Miyamoto had already made a game that was about a plumber versus a gorilla, and plumbers battling crabs and fireballs coming out of pipes, so why not a game that explores the natural enmity between dragons and the devil? As you can see, the devil stands at the top wearing what appears to be a red Speedo, while your little green dragon runs around the maze. Now, venturing into hell and doing battle with the devil would not really seem like a task that you'd want to be involved in, but luckily it's much easier because there are oddly enough crucifixes lying all around the place, and you have to grab a crucifix in order to eat the little dots. Also, while holding a cross, you can throw fireballs at your enemies. The crosses are strictly temporary. Once you hold on to one for a little while, it disappears, but you can grab another. They never actually disappear when you grab them. They remain there, so you never really run out of crosses. However, the game is made a lot more difficult by the fact that the maze is constantly changing. These little fellows here are turning the gears that move the walls of the maze, and you can actually get squished. And the second level is even stranger. It has you collecting what I assume are Bibles, grabbing a hold of them, and moving them to the center. Oops, there we go. Moving them to the center of the maze. Once you've got all 4 Bibles in place, then you move on to the next level. And again, the question of why there's a giant golden cross in the middle of Devil World is also a mystery that will not be solved. Something that does give you a little hint is if you watch the devil, he points in the direction that he's going to command his minions to move the walls in. So right now he's telling them to move left. That sort of gives you a little bit of a tiny hint as to which way the walls are going to start moving next. This is actually a reasonably fun game. It can be a bit challenging if you're not careful. It's very easy to get squished. But mostly, I think the biggest impression that someone from the US might have when playing this game is just how damn weird it is. Now, the reason this was not released in the US was, of course, that Nintendo, when they started putting out games for the United States, had a very strict policy about not using any kind of religious symbolism in their games. Later games, such as Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy, would also be changed because of this. Here we have a bonus screen where you simply run around collecting these mysterious little items here. They're either books or boxes. So while this certainly isn't the best game that Miyamoto ever made, it's certainly worth playing, just for the sheer what the fuck value of it. And from November 1984, we have F1 Race. This is actually a Japanese-only game. For some reason, it was never released in the US, and it is in fact the first racing game for the Famicom. As you can see, there are 3 skill levels, each one slightly more difficult than the first. And as you can see, it is a rear-view racing game. Now, this was still a relatively new genre back in 1984. The first racing game that really sort of took off in this format was, of course, Pole Position from 1982. A couple years down the line, Sega's Outrun really sort of raised the stakes for these kind of games. However, F1 is stuck firmly in the pole position mold. It has a slightly higher camera angle than pole position, but it has all the typical pole position accoutrements, such as mountains in the background, Formula 1 racing cars, little signs with advertisements that go by as you drive. The pseudo 3D effects are pretty limited. Take a look at that Nintendo sign in the background. It never actually gets any larger as you drive towards it. It must be an enormous sign. Everything else, though, looks pretty good. Of course, this is not actual 3D. It's all done using different size sprites. An interesting question is, why wasn't this game released in the US? There's really nothing wrong with it. It's reasonably fun. Maybe not quite as good as Pole Position, but it's quite playable. The car handles pretty well. There were actually much worse racing games made by Nintendo later for the system. Or rather, not made by Nintendo, but released for the Famicom. And there wasn't really any competition on the Nintendo for this game. There weren't other racing games that came out at the same time, so there doesn't really seem to be any reason why this game was never released in the US. Now, once you complete a track, you move on to the next track, slightly different environment. You're out in the desert or something. This sort of constantly changing colors for each track was pretty standard at the time. It gives the levels a little bit of variety. And of course, this is in the pole position school of one hit blows up your car. This is 2 gears. You can see the high and the low speed. All in all, this is a very simple but quite enjoyable little racing game. Nothing too mind-blowing, but it does, you can kill a little bit of time with this. Why it wasn't released in the US will remain a mystery. Now, this game, as I mentioned earlier, was released in November of 1984. This is actually the first game in a series of 8 games released in November. By this time, the Famicom had become quite successful in Japan, and the Nintendo was apparently gearing up for the big holiday rush. So they released a pretty much unprecedented 8 games in a single month. Remember, of course, there were only 6 games released in the entire first half of 1984. In fact, I'd say that November 84 sort of represents the point when Nintendo really started putting games out for the Famicom at a pretty frantic rate. Beginning in 1985, we'll see a dramatic increase in the number of games coming out for this system. Here's a game I assume will need no introduction to most people. This is Pac-Man, developed by Namco. This is, of course, a port of their 1979 massive arcade hit. This version is actually the Japanese version for the Famicom, so the ghosts have the original names, not the more familiar names that you've seen from the American arcade version. Now, this game has been released, quite a few times for home consoles over the years. For example, there's the extremely notorious Atari 2600 version that really played nothing at all like the arcade. More accurate versions had come out since then, but nothing quite like this. This one is basically almost pixel perfect to the arcade. The size and shape of the maze is correct. A lot of earlier versions had sort of stretched it out to make it a more horizontal shape to fit a television screen. This version, as you can see, has a black bar on the side that keeps the maze in its original shape. Now, obviously, Pac-Man was a few years old by the time this version came out, but even in 1984, I'm sure there were plenty of people who would be interested in getting their hands on an arcade-perfect version of Pac-Man for a home system. The game was really that popular. Pac-Man is one of those few video games that has sort of a timeless appeal. It never really seems to grow old. Even today, of course, it's still very, very playable and a lot of fun. So I guess the final verdict on Pac-Man for the Famicom is that it's highly recommended. One thing that is a little odd about this version of Pac-Man is that it wasn't released in the US until the 1990s, believe it or not. In fact, a lot of the Famicom Namco titles were not released in the US. For example, Galaxian wasn't. And frankly, that's something we'll be seeing a lot more of in the near future for the Famicom, is titles that are only released in Japan. Once Nintendo started dealing with all these outside developers, a lot of the games were never released in the United States. Namco released a whole series of ports of their classic arcade games that didn't come out in the US. It's really kind of a shame because these games play so well. In the US, there wasn't really anything quite equivalent to these versions. As you can see here, even the little cutscenes between levels are present. Well, barely a year has gone by, and there's already a second Mahjong title for the Famicom. This one is for Nin Uchi Mahjong. That means something along the lines of 4-player Mahjong, or 4-striking human Mahjong. As you can see here, unlike Nintendo's Mahjong title, there's actually 4 different rows, as in 4 people are playing, just like a real game of Mahjong. Of course, here only one person is actually, one player is playing, the other 3 are controlled by the computer. This game was developed by Hudson Soft. Unlike their first 2 titles, this one was not a port of an earlier version. There seem to be 2 gameplay variations. Unfortunately, I certainly don't know the difference between the 2 of them. The game doesn't look quite as pretty as Nintendo's Mahjong. How does it actually play? I really couldn't tell you. So while this game is sort of interesting looking, I guess we'd have to say this one is for Famicom completists or Mahjong freaks only. Doesn't really have that much general appeal. Xevious. This is yet another Namco release of one of their classic arcade games. This game is pretty well known. I'll assume a lot of folks are familiar with it, but for those who aren't, this is one of those rare games that practically defined an entire genre, in this case the vertical shooter. Now, of course, there were actually vertical shooters before this, but this is, I guess, the first one that was actually really good. A lot of the previous vertical shooters you found in arcades were really not that fun. This game introduced a number of things, including sort of the dual systems of using both bombs and some sort of laser to destroy your enemies. You would occasionally come across much larger, harder to defeat bosses. This is a very accurate port of Xevious. The arcade game came out all the way back in 1982, so the graphics weren't too advanced. Now this one did eventually come out in the US, but for some reason it wasn't actually released until 1988. Still, there was something about this game I guess they felt warranted a US release, whereas some of the other Namco ports didn't get one. Next up, Urban Champion. Talk about going from the sublime to the ridiculous. While Xevious was an all-time classic, I'm sure this is nobody's idea of a classic game. However, it is quite historically important. This was one of the very first one-on-one fighting games. Earlier in 1984, there was an arcade game called Karate Champ, which you might remember was quite popular at the time. And I guess this game was pretty much the second fighting game ever made. There were some sort of proto-fighting games that came out of arcades before this, but this one really has a lot of the features that would define early fighting games. You can play against the computer or against another person, and the object is basically just to beat the other guy up. Now there's something there called stamina. That's not quite the same thing as a life meter. However, if it does run out, you will lose. It's actually pretty hard to get your stamina all the way down, though. It goes down when you throw a punch, and it goes down when you get hit, but quite frankly, it seems like the fights usually end before your stamina runs out. Now, how you win this game is by knocking your opponent into a manhole, which you're about to see in a moment here. You have two punches, or two attacks. There is a light punch, and or rather I should say a light attack and a strong attack. It can be either a punch or a kick, depending on which way you've pressed the D-pad. The light attack will merely stun the opponent for a second. The strong attack will actually knock them backwards a bit. So you've got to use your strong attack, either the punch or the kick, to keep pushing the other guy backwards until they fall into the manhole. Every so often, a cop will drive by, and the characters act nonchalant. Then the game starts again. There we go. You've won the round, and the woman in the apartment above showers you with confetti. Of course, not everyone likes fighting in the streets. There's also another apartment resident who will occasionally drop a flower pot on your head. I guess this neighborhood can't be too bad if it has a bookstore. Yes, this is a pretty simple fighting game. You can block. You have two attacks. No sort of special moves or anything like that. In fact, this is more or less just an application of button mashing, quite frankly. Even against another live person, it seems to sort of who can get in the strong attack the quickest. Not really too much strategy, but rather just sort of trying to just keep hitting the other guy over and over and over again. Here you'll see the stamina go all the way down, and the time run out. When the time runs out, they will arrest you if your stamina is too low. And I've lost the round. Now here we have Mappy. This is a port of Namco's 1983 arcade game. I remember this game quite well in arcades, but apparently it was more successful in Japan than it was in the US, which might explain why this Famicom release never came out in the US. Now the object of this game is to go around collecting these stolen goods inside this house here. Apparently this cat and his kittens are a gang of criminals. They've stolen various electronic goods and paintings and whatnot. You can't actually really hurt the cats despite having some kind of baton or something in your hand, but you do go around collecting the goods. The one sort of weapon that you have is doors. Opening a door in front of a cat will knock it back a bit. opening one of the flashing microwave doors will actually send some sort of wave of microwave radiation and knock over any cats off to the side of the screen. You get up and down by jumping up and down the little trampolines there, and you're actually, you can't be harmed while you're in the air, but you can be harmed while you're walking along the ground. They're actually sort of like a little kind of grace period as you jump on a trampoline, whereas if one of the cats jumps on the trampoline at the same time, you won't really be hurt. Otherwise, though, it's you have to be careful opening doors, because if you open a door, it can knock you back into one of the cats. Now, Mappy is one of those strange names that Japanese games sometimes have that really don't make much sense in English, Pac-Man being another good example. Apparently, Mappo is Japanese slang for a police officer. There is a bonus round in this game. The objects go around collecting balloons. This is a bit trickier because, as you can see, jumping on the trampolines make them change color. Once they become red, jumping on them one last time will cause them to break. So Mappy is really not that well known in the West, however it is a rather fun game to play, and the Famicom version is very accurate and highly recommended. Next up, we have Clu Clu Land by Nintendo. This is sort of an oddball title. It's a little surprising, but this actually was one of the launch titles on the American NES system. Now you might be wondering, what exactly does Clu Clu mean? Well, once again, this is just sort of a romanization of a Japanese word, kuru kuru, which means around and around, which is exactly what you do in this game. The control mechanism on this game is a little strange, and quite frankly, it's a little difficult to get used to. As you can see, the screen is filled with all these little pivots that you can revolve around. You always move in a straight line unless you press the button and extend your claw. That will allow you to sort of swing around the pivots. When you let go, you stop swinging, and then you move in a straight line. Occasionally there are little obstacles, such as little things that make you bounce off of them. Each stage has a hidden pattern of gold bars. As you pass over where one of the gold bars is, it'll be revealed. The object of the game is to reveal the entire pattern on each screen. It changes from screen to screen. They're actually sort of random patterns. They tend to be pictures, simple shapes, that sort of thing. If you run into any of the sea urchins or the black hole in the middle, you'll lose a life. This is certainly a unique and interesting concept for a game. I only wish it was easier to control. I actually think that it might be a matter of sort of practice when it comes to learning how to control this thing. When I tried playing it for the film here, I wasn't doing very good. In the past I was much better at it. Still, though, I do get the feeling that this thing is kind of hard to control. Maybe it's simply because of the fact that the control scheme is completely different from anything you've really seen in other games. It's not that Clu Clu Land is really a bad game, it's just sort of an unusual game, and it's one that takes a little while to get the hang of. There actually is some sort of plot behind all this. Apparently the story is that the sea urchins stole some sort of treasure of gold bars, and it's your job to go down and recover them. Not that's really necessary to be to play the game, but Nintendo was, of course, to put some kind of very simple story into their games. Of course, that was found pretty much exclusively inside the instruction book. Not really hinted at during gameplay itself, as was the case back then. It wasn't until a little bit later that the actual story gets told in the game itself rather than just in the instruction booklet. So while Clu Clu Land is actually kind of fun to play, once you get the hang of it, you might find yourself being frustrated at first. But I think if you stick with it for a little while and sort of learn the feel of the controls, you'll find it's actually a pretty fun game. Wow, here's what I'm sure you'll remember, ExciteBike. First of all, this game has got to have the most inappropriate music you can possibly imagine. For some reason that little musical theme does not really bring up images of racing on a motocross bike. Still, this game is quite good. In fact, this is probably the most well-remembered and most loved of all the early Nintendo games. And this is, for such an early game, it's a surprisingly deep game. This is one that everyone seems to have played back in the day, and you can see why, because it's actually very fun. Now, I'll admit that I have actually not played this game in some time, and I'm not very good at it at the moment, but the object is, of course, to race a dirt bike. Now that sounds very simple, but there are a number of interesting things in this game that make it a bit more complicated. First of all, you have two acceleration buttons. The B button is sort of a turbo button. When you hit that button, it will make you go faster, but it'll also cause your engine to heat up. There's a temperature gauge right in the middle of the screen there. As the red bar fills up the gauge, your engine gets hotter and hotter. If it gets too hot, you will actually stall the engine. You'll have to wait till it cools down. So one of the keys of this game is very careful use of your turbo button. Furthermore, the D-pad hitting up or down will control the angle of the bike when you're in the air. So while you're in the air, you're going to have to adjust your angle to make sure you land correctly. Landing at the wrong angle will cause you to crash your bike. Now there's two gameplay variations. You can do a solo timed race, or you can race against other riders. As you're going along there, you actually see a best time listed repeatedly in the background. That's the time you're trying to beat in order to move on to the next race. If you fail to get that time, the game will be over. And of course, there are additional obstacles like dirt patches in the road. It'll slow you down a little bit. Selection B is the option against other motorcyclists, other riders. And you can knock them off their bikes. You can get knocked off your bike. So in a number of ways, ExciteBike was the most advanced racing game that had been made at this time, at least the most advanced for a home system. There were certainly a lot more elements to this than were in F1 Racing that had been released shortly before this. Now this of course was one of the games that Nintendo actually made an arcade version of as well. These games were designed for the Famicom. Eventually Nintendo released a series of arcade games, some that had multiple games on one machine, some that had dual screens for 2 players, and of course just like regular standalone units as well. I could be mistaken, but I think this game was released in the arcades in the US before the NES was actually released for sale in the United States. So for a lot of US kids, we saw these early Famicom games first as arcade games, then as home console games later. So it was sort of the opposite of Japan, where they were home games that were ported to the arcade. We sort of saw the home versions as ports of arcade games. So I do remember this game being quite popular in the arcades at the time. Like several early Famicom games, there is a design level. You can simply go along and design your own track using the D-pad to select which option you want to enter. And of course, once you're done designing your own track, you can just go ahead and try it out and race on it. So what's our final verdict on ExciteBike? Well, I'd say so far out of all the early Famicom games, this is definitely one of the best. It's also, in some ways, one of the more difficult to get into. You can't just pick it up and play it like the way you can F1 racing. It actually does take a bit of practice to get used to the controls. Otherwise, you will be crashing your bike quite frequently. But once you've sort of taken the time to play the game, you'll find it's a very rewarding experience. Well, we've now reached 1985. As we'll see in later episodes of Chrontendo, this will be a banner year for the Famicom. At the moment, however, we'll take a look at two games released in January of that year. Now here we have the first game of 1985, the Nintendo-developed Balloon Fight. Now, if you spent any time at all in the arcades in the 1980s, you might be thinking, this game seems somehow strangely familiar. Well, that's because it's a rather bleak clone of Joust. Except instead of being on flying ostriches, you're a little guy with a balloon attached to him. For those of you not familiar with Joust, how this game is played is you hit the button rapidly to flap your arms, use the D-pad to control which direction your character is heading in, and you do actually have a bit of momentum, which means that it's not really easy to simply turn around or stop yourself. You sort of have to hit down on the control pad and you'll slowly come screech to a stop and then turn around. You fight the other characters by bumping into them, but you actually have to be a little bit higher than them. If you do this correctly, you will pop their balloon and they'll go sailing down. If they are higher than you, they'll pop your balloon. Now your character is lucky in that he has two balloons rather than just one, so you can actually get hit twice. If your character falls into the lake, they'll drown. If they land on ground, you have to knock them over before they inflate another balloon. Occasionally lightning will flash. This will kill you if it hits you. And as we progress from level to level, the layouts get a little bit stranger. Something to be aware of is the giant fish in the lake. If you get too close to the lake for more than a second or two, the fish will eat you. Oh, here we have a bonus round. The object is simply to collect balloons. The bonus rounds were pretty ubiquitous in video games at this time. Just every so often, of course, you'd get one of these little things. There's no enemies. You'd have to rack up extra points. This game is sort of unique in the sense that you don't really see Nintendo making a whole lot of clones of other titles. I guess they must have made this one out of sheer desperation for lack of new ideas. After all, they were having a pretty hectic release schedule about this time. Don't get me wrong, Balloon Fight is a fun game, and I would highly recommend it, but then again, Joust was also a fun game. Now there is one final gameplay option here, and that's this balloon flight, where you simply navigate through a field of electrical sparks and try to collect balloons. This is also fun, but it's, not too terribly exciting. And we're going to close out episode 2 of Chrontendo with a game called Ice Climber. This game is fondly remembered, at least by some people. You control Popo, a blue-suited Eskimo armed with a hammer, who goes around clubbing seals. The story behind this game is that a bird, some sort of condor, has stolen all your eggplants, and your job is to climb to the top of the mountain and get them back. Now, we admit this doesn't really make a lot of sense, but really, do most video games actually make any sense? Now, this game is fun, but there are a few things about it that are a little on the weird side. Especially those things involving jumping up and getting from level to level. First of all, the bricks that you're busting through are quite narrow, yet you can actually jump through to the next level even after breaking only a single brick, even though the space provided is much smaller than your character. For some reason, when I play the game, I keep forgetting the fact that my big fat Eskimo can fit through the little tiny crevice between two pieces of ice that I always end up breaking out 2 or 3 bricks in order to get him through. Now, second of all, your jump is a little weird. Even though you clear quite a bit of vertical distance when you jump, you have very little horizontal movement. And just as you can jump through the edge of a platform, you can also fall through it as well. A lot of times you'll jump, think you're going to land on the edge of the platform, and end up falling just right through. As a result, some of the platforming aspects of this game are a bit more frustrating than they should be. The only way you can really jump onto a platform is to get as close to the edge as possible, jump up, and then press the D-pad to the left or right, and try to get your player to land on the actual platform as opposed to just falling right through it. This makes the bonus levels, the bonus parts of each level, quite a bit more difficult than you think they would be. Now, the object of the bonus level, aside from grabbing eggplants, is to try to grab the condor at the very, very top. Once you make your way to the very top of the mountain, try to grab the condor by the legs. This, of course, will then put you at the bottom of the next level, and you repeat all over again. The levels do tend to get progressively more difficult as you go. Of course, they do things like more moving platforms, sort of conveyor belt type platforms, that sort of thing. Now, this game, of course, was released in the United States. However, apparently someone decided that having the main character go around clubbing seals was perhaps a bit offensive to some. So they changed the seals into these strange little balls of cotton, which are supposedly supposed to be yetis. Other than that, the game is pretty much the same. Now, one thing you might wonder is, looking at the cover, you see a polar bear wearing a Speedo swimsuit and sunglasses. Where is that character? He only seems to appear if you stay on one level for a very long time. We'll see that in just a moment. If you sort of stand in one place without moving up, after a few minutes he will come out, jump up and down, stomp the screen, and cause you to move up one level. In a number of ways, Ice Climber sort of marks the end of an era for the Famicom. Prior to this, the majority of the games released for the system were designed by Nintendo themselves. Nintendo designed and published, I believe, 6 games in November and January of 84 and 85 respectively. From this point onward, we're only going to see a handful of Nintendo titles scattered among many, many, many titles released by other companies.